The black leather wallet lay on the cracked dashboard of Kerubo Moraa's old taxi like a test sent from heaven itself. Inside were stacks of dollars, gold credit cards, and documents tied to one of the most powerful CEOs in Kenya. At that same moment, Kerubo's little daughter lay weak in a hospital bed waiting for medicine he could no longer afford. People around him said the same thing. Keep the money. Rich men never suffer. But hours later, the poor taxi driver stood in front of a shining corporate tower and returned every single cent. What happened next shocked everyone watching and uncovered secrets capable of destroying an entire empire. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your country. And if stories about justice, hope, and humanity touch your heart, don't forget to subscribe and join our family. Every morning before sunrise, Kerubo Moraa parked his old yellow taxi beside a roadside tea stall near downtown Nairobi and prayed quietly before starting the engine. The taxi coughed like an old man with weak lungs. Sometimes it took 3 tries before the engine finally obeyed him. Each morning, Kerubo feared that one day the car would simply refuse to wake up at all. And if that happened, everything in his life would collapse with it. Because the taxi was not just a vehicle. It was school fees, it was rent, it was food, it was medicine. Most importantly, it was the thin line standing between his daughter and death. Kerubo rubbed his tired eyes and checked the small amount of money folded inside his shirt pocket. Not enough. Still not enough. Across the street, Nairobi was slowly coming alive. Street vendors arranged bananas and roasted maize on wooden tables. Office workers hurried toward crowded buses. Motorcycle riders shouted at each other in traffic. Somewhere nearby, church music drifted softly through the cold morning air. But inside Kerubo's chest, there was only pressure. Heavy pressure that never left anymore. 3 years earlier, his life had been different. Not perfect, but human. His wife, Wanjiru, had still been alive then. Their tiny apartment in Eastlands had been full of laughter instead of silence. Wanjiru sold vegetables in the market while Kerubo drove his taxi long hours through Nairobi traffic. They had struggled, yes, but they had struggled together. Then the sickness came, fast, cruel, merciless. By the time doctors discovered the cancer, it had already spread too far. Kerubo sold nearly everything trying to save her. Furniture disappeared first, then electronics, then Wanjiru's wedding jewelry. In the end, even that had not been enough. Now only 2 things remained from his old life: the taxi and their daughter. Naledi, he whispered softly to himself. Just saying her name made him sit straighter. She was only 9 years old, but lately sickness had stolen the brightness from her face. The doctors called it a severe heart condition. Surgery could help, they said, but surgery required money. People like Kerubo never touched in their entire lives. Every week, the hospital added new bills. Every week, Kerubo promised himself he would somehow find a way. And every week, reality humiliated him again. That morning, his phone vibrated. It was another message from the hospital. Payment required urgently. Kerubo stared at the screen for several seconds before quietly locking the phone again. He could not bear reading the rest. A customer suddenly knocked on the taxi window. "Town center," the man asked, impatiently. Kerubo forced a smile. "Yes, brother, get in." The day moved slowly after that. Some passengers treated him kindly. Most ignored him completely. A few insulted him openly whenever traffic became heavy. One wealthy businessman spent nearly 20 minutes shouting at Kerubo for taking the wrong route, even though every road in Nairobi was already packed with cars. "You drivers are all the same," the man snapped while stepping out. "Lazy and stupid." Kerubo said nothing. He simply nodded and drove away. Long ago, insults used to wound him deeply, but poverty had a way of exhausting pride. Eventually, survival became more important than defending dignity. Around midday, Kerubo parked near a small food stand and bought the cheapest plate of rice he could afford. Before taking his first bite, he noticed two street children staring at him nearby. One boy could not have been older than 6. Without hesitation, Kerubo divided the food into 3 portions and called them over. The children ate so quickly it hurt to watch. "Thank you, Uncle," the smaller boy whispered afterward. Kerubo smiled faintly. "It's all right." But once they left, he stared down at the tiny amount of rice remaining on his plate. Still, he did not regret it. Hunger recognized hunger. That evening, after another exhausting shift, Kerubo finally visited Naledi at the public hospital. The smell of medicine and bleach filled the crowded hallway. Patients overflowed into corridors because there were not enough beds. Nurses moved quickly from room to room with tired eyes. Naledi looked smaller every time he saw her. She smiled weakly when he entered. "Papa." Kerubo immediately sat beside her and kissed her forehead. "How are you feeling today?" "I'm okay," she lied softly. Children always tried protecting the people who protected them. Kerubo noticed untouched food beside her bed. "You didn't eat. I was waiting for you." His heart twisted painfully. He picked up the spoon and gently fed her while she leaned weakly against the pillow. For a few precious minutes, the world outside disappeared. No debts, no sickness, no fear, only father and daughter. Naledi suddenly looked at him carefully. "You're tired again," she whispered. Kerubo forced another smile. "Your father is strong, but you don't sleep. I sleep. You're lying." That almost made him laugh, almost. Naledi had Wanjiru's eyes, the same eyes that always saw truth too clearly. "Papa," she said quietly after a moment, "if the medicine is too expensive." "It's okay." Kerubo froze completely. "No," he said immediately. But no. The firmness in his voice surprised even him. He grabbed her small hand carefully. "You listen to me, Naledi Moraa. As long as your father is breathing, you will never give up. Never." Tears gathered in her eyes. Kerubo looked away quickly, because his own eyes were already burning. A nurse approached moments later, carrying papers. "Mr. Moraa," she said gently, "the payment deadline has passed again." Kerubo lowered his head. "I know. We need at least something by tomorrow morning." Tomorrow. Always tomorrow. As if tomorrow magically carried mercy for poor people. "I'll find it," he whispered. The nurse nodded sadly because she had heard those same words from many fathers before. Later that night, Kerubo returned to work because he had no other choice. Nairobi after dark became a completely different city. Neon lights reflected across wet roads. Loud music escaped from clubs and bars. Rich people laughed inside restaurants, while homeless men slept near closed shops only streets away. The contrast always disturbed him. How could one city contain so much wealth and so much suffering? At the same time, near midnight, his phone battery was almost dead when one final ride request appeared. Airport pickup. Normally, he would have ignored it because he was exhausted. But airport customers usually paid better than ordinary passengers. So Kerubo accepted. 30 minutes later, he parked outside Jomo Kenyatta International Airport and waited quietly among dozens of other taxis. Then he saw him. A tall man wearing an expensive dark coat stepped out of the terminal, surrounded by silence that seemed heavier than the luggage in his hands. Even before entering the taxi, the stranger looked like a man carrying invisible pain. "Westlands," the man said quietly while climbing into the back seat. His voice was calm, controlled, but broken underneath. Kerubo started driving through the glowing Nairobi streets. For several minutes, neither man spoke. Then the businessman's phone rang. Kerubo watched through the mirror as the man answered. "What do you mean the board knows already?" the stranger said sharply. Silence. Then his jaw tightened. "No. Don't send anything yet." Another silence. Finally, the man closed his eyes. "If this leaks tomorrow, everything burns." Kerubo looked away respectfully. He had carried enough pain in his own life to recognize it inside another human being, even a rich one. Several minutes later, while Nairobi lights moved silently across the taxi windows, Kerubo noticed something unexpected. The wealthy businessman was crying quietly in the back seat. Not loudly, not dramatically, just silent tears falling from the face of a man who looked like he had everything in the world. And for the first time that night, Kerubo realized money did not protect people from breaking inside. The rest of the ride passed in silence. Kerubo Moraa kept both hands firmly on the steering wheel, while Nairobi's midnight lights stretched endlessly across the wet roads ahead of him. In the back seat, the wealthy passenger sat motionless beside the window, staring into the darkness, as if he no longer recognized the city outside. The man's expensive phone rang again. This time he did not answer immediately. He closed his eyes first. Then he inhaled slowly before pressing the screen against his ear. "What now?" he asked quietly. Even exhausted, his voice carried authority. The kind of authority ordinary people immediately recognized. Not loud, not aggressive, but powerful enough to make other men nervous. Kerubo listened without appearing to listen. Years of driving taxis had taught him that passengers revealed their true selves when they believed the driver was invisible. The voice on the other end spoke rapidly. Suddenly, the businessman leaned forward. "No," he snapped sharply. "Nobody moves money until I review everything myself." A pause followed. Then his expression hardened even further. "You told me the accounts were clean." Another silence. Kerubo glanced briefly into the rearview mirror. For the first time, he saw anger replacing sadness. Dangerous anger. "If the media sees those files tomorrow morning," the man whispered coldly, "Mwangi Group collapses." Kerubo quickly looked back at the road. Mwangi Group. Even poor people knew that name. Daniel Mwangi, one of the richest men in Kenya, owner of hotels, banks, transport companies, and half the new buildings rising across Nairobi. People on television called him a genius businessman. Others called him ruthless. Some claimed he had forgotten what poverty looked like. But none of those rumors matched the broken man sitting quietly in the back seat now. Several minutes later, the businessman ended the call and loosened his tie slowly. The expensive watch on his wrist probably cost more money than Kerubo earned in 5 years. Yet at that moment, the rich man looked exhausted beyond words. "You can stop at the next tower," he said quietly. Kerubo nodded. "Bo, As they entered Westlands, the streets grew cleaner and brighter. Tall buildings, covered in glass, reflected neon lights across the night sky. Luxury restaurants remained crowded even after midnight. Security guards stood outside expensive apartments, while luxury cars glided silently past. This part of Nairobi felt like another country entirely. Kerubo sometimes wondered how people could live surrounded by such wealth, while only a few kilometers away, children slept hungry beside open sewage drains. Finally, the taxi stopped in front of a massive corporate tower glowing with silver lights. Mwangi Group Holdings. The words stretched proudly across the entrance. Several security guards immediately hurried forward the moment the businessman stepped out of the taxi. "Good evening, sir." "Welcome back, Mr. Mwangi. Board members are waiting upstairs." So it was true. Kerubo had unknowingly spent the last 40 minutes driving one of the most powerful men in Kenya through Nairobi traffic. Daniel Mwangi reached into his coat pocket distractedly, while another phone call buzzed loudly in his hand. For a brief moment, he looked back toward the taxi, as though wanting to say something. Instead, he simply nodded once. "Thank you, driver." Then he turned and disappeared inside the shining building surrounded by guards and assistants. Kerubo remained parked for several seconds afterward. Not because of the billionaire, but because of the sadness he had seen inside the man's eyes. Money was strange. Poor people spent their lives dreaming about it. Yet the richest passengers often looked the emptiest. Eventually, Kerubo sighed and drove away. The night was growing colder. He needed one or two more passengers before finally going home. But business became slow after midnight. Most people already had transport or stayed inside bars and clubs until morning. After another hour with no customers, Kerubo finally parked near a quiet roadside fuel station. His stomach hurt from hunger. He had not eaten since afternoon. Reaching into his pocket, he counted the little money he had earned that day. Still not enough for Naledi's hospital payment. Not even close. The thought crushed him instantly. Tomorrow morning, the doctors would ask again. Tomorrow, the landlord would ask again. Tomorrow, the taxi loan office would call again. Every day of his life now began with another debt waiting for him. Kerubo leaned his forehead against the steering wheel and closed his eyes. Just for a minute, just long enough to breathe. But suddenly, his elbow touched something beneath the passenger seat. He frowned. At first, he assumed it was trash left behind by a customer, but when he reached down carefully, his fingers froze around soft black leather. A wallet. Kerubo slowly pulled it into the light. The moment he saw the gold initials pressed into the leather, his heart skipped painfully. Daniel Mwangi. Immediately he understood. The billionaire had left it behind. Kerubo stared at the wallet for several seconds without moving. Then very carefully he opened it. And the world around him seemed to stop breathing. Stacks of American dollars filled one side. Thick bundles, neatly folded. More money than Kerubo had ever held in his entire life. Several gold bank cards gleamed beneath the station lights. There were also identification cards, business cards, and folded documents stamped "confidential" across the top. Kerubo swallowed hard. His hands suddenly felt weak. Slowly, almost fearfully, he counted only one stack. It alone could pay Naledi's hospital bills. Not part of them, all of them. The surgery, the medicine, everything. His breathing became shallow. For a long moment, he simply stared at the money, while countless thoughts crashed violently through his mind. Naledi smiling again. Naledi leaving the hospital. Naledi returning to school. No more debt collectors. No more begging doctors for time. No more choosing between food and medicine. One decision could change everything. And nobody would ever know. The billionaire probably owned dozens of wallets. Men like Daniel Mwangi spent more money in one night than poor families saw in years. Meanwhile, Kerubo's daughter was lying in a hospital bed, struggling to survive. Was this not fate? Was this not finally God answering after years of suffering? Outside, the taxi cars continued moving normally through Nairobi streets. But inside the old vehicle, Kerubo Moraa sat trapped between desperation and conscience. His phone suddenly rang loudly. The sound nearly made him jump. Hospital. Kerubo answered immediately. Hello? The nurse sounded tired. Mr. Moraa, Naledi's condition became unstable again tonight. Fear exploded through his chest. What happened? She's okay for now, but the doctor says treatment cannot continue much longer without payment. Kerubo closed his eyes tightly. The wallet rested heavily in his lap, full of enough money to save her. Please, the nurse said softly, try to come tomorrow morning. The call ended. Silence returned again. Kerubo looked down at the stacks of dollars one more time, then toward the small photograph of Naledi taped beside his dashboard. His daughter's smiling face stared back at him innocently, and for the first time in many years, Kerubo felt truly afraid of himself. Kerubo Moraa did not sleep that night. The wallet remained on the small wooden table beside his bed, while darkness filled the cramped apartment around him. Every few minutes his eyes drifted back toward it, as though the black leather itself was whispering to him, "Take the money, save your daughter, end this suffering." Outside the thin apartment walls, Eastlands never truly became quiet. Distant music echoed through narrow streets. Dogs barked. Motorcycles roared past. Somewhere nearby, a couple argued loudly before silence swallowed their voices again. But inside Kerubo's room, another battle was happening, a far more dangerous one. Naledi slept beside him on the mattress, breathing weakly beneath a thin blanket. Even in sleep, her small body looked tired, too tired for a child. Kerubo stared at her for a long time. Then slowly, almost fearfully, he opened the wallet again. The dollars looked unreal beneath the dim light bulb hanging from the ceiling. Clean, fresh, powerful. Enough money to change everything overnight. He picked up one stack carefully. His fingers trembled. One stack alone could pay the hospital immediately. Another could clear his rent debts. Another could repair the taxi completely. For the first time in years, the future no longer looked hopeless, and yet something inside him felt deeply wrong. Kerubo placed the money back down quick, almost as if it burned him. He stood and walked toward the tiny kitchen corner instead. The sink leaked constantly. Empty cups sat stacked beside old cooking pots Wanjiru once used. Seeing them still hurt. Sometimes he imagined he could still hear her singing while preparing tea in the mornings. Wanjiru had believed fiercely in honesty, even when life treated them cruelly, especially then. You cannot control poverty, she used to say, but you can control the kind of person suffering turns you into. Kerubo closed his eyes painfully. If she were alive now, what would she tell him to do? His thoughts were interrupted by a weak cough behind him. Naledi was awake. "Papa." He hurried back immediately. "What is it?" "My flower. I'm thirsty." Kerubo helped her sit carefully before giving her water from a plastic cup. She drank slowly while watching his face. "You didn't sleep?" she whispered. "I will." "You're worried again." Children noticed everything. Kerubo forced a smile. "I'm just tired." Naledi's eyes moved toward the wallet on the table. "What's that?" His stomach tightened instantly. Something a customer forgot. She looked at it curiously. "Will you return it?" The question struck him harder than any insult ever could. Naledi asked it so naturally, so innocently, as if honesty were obvious, as if morality were easy when your child was dying. Kerubo sat beside her quietly. "There's a lot of money inside," he admitted softly. Naledi blinked slowly. "Enough for my medicine?" He could not answer immediately, because the truth was yes. More than enough. Finally, he nodded once. Naledi lowered her eyes toward the blanket. Then, after several seconds, she spoke very softly. Mama would still return it. The words shattered something inside him. Kerubo looked away quickly before she could see tears filling his eyes. Sometimes children carried wisdom adults lost long ago. He gently kissed her forehead before helping her lie down again. "Sleep," he whispered. But long after Naledi closed her eyes again, Kerubo remained sitting beside the table, staring at the wallet. The temptation did not disappear. If anything, it became stronger, because now he knew exactly what he would be sacrificing. Near dawn, someone knocked loudly at his apartment door. Kerubo quickly hid the wallet beneath a folded shirt before opening the door carefully. It was Kamau, an older taxi driver from the neighborhood. "Brother," Kamau sighed while entering, "you disappeared last night. I thought police arrested you again." Kerubo managed a tired smile. "Not this time." Kamau noticed his expression immediately. "What happened?" For a moment, Kerubo considered staying silent, but exhaustion weakened him, so he explained everything. The billionaire passenger, the wallet, the money. Kamau listened quietly until the end. Then he laughed in disbelief. "You are thinking too much." Kerubo frowned. "What?" Kamau pointed toward the hidden wallet. "That money is your miracle. It's not mine. Brother, rich people steal every day, and nobody arrests them." Kamau shook his head. "Your daughter is sick, while billionaires swim in money. God finally sends you help, and you want to return it." Kerubo remained silent. Kamau moved closer. "Listen to me carefully. Daniel Mwangi will not suffer because one wallet disappears, but your daughter will suffer if you return it." The words hit hard because they carried painful truth. Kamau sighed heavily before continuing. "You think rich men care about honesty? Tomorrow, they will forget your face. Meanwhile, you will still be poor." Kerubo rubbed his forehead tiredly. "You don't understand." "No, you don't understand." Kamau's voice softened. "Poverty kills good men because good men keep sacrificing themselves for principles that never feed their families." For several moments, neither man spoke. Then Kamau quietly stood. "If I were you," he said while walking toward the door, "I would save my child first." After he left, silence returned once again, But now the apartment felt even smaller, hotter, heavier. Kerubo looked toward Naledi, sleeping peacefully, then toward the hidden wallet. Hours passed. Morning sunlight slowly entered through the cracked window. Finally, Kerubo stood up suddenly, as though making a painful decision before fear could stop him. He reached for the wallet, opened it carefully, and searched through the contents again. Business cards, bank cards, documents. Then finally, he found one elegant card embossed with silver letters. Daniel Mwangi, CEO. Mwangi, Group Holdings. Below it was the company address in Westlands. Kerubo stared at the card for a long time. His chest felt tight. Returning the wallet meant returning to suffering. Maybe years more of it. Maybe forever. But keeping it meant becoming someone Wanjiru would no longer recognize. Someone Naledi should never become. Slowly, Kerubo placed every dollar carefully back inside exactly as he found it. Then he hid the wallet beneath his jacket. At that exact moment, his phone rang again. The hospital. Kerubo answered immediately. Mr. Moraa, the nurse said gently, the doctor is asking about payment again. Kerubo closed his eyes briefly. I know. We cannot delay much longer. Pain stabbed through his chest. He looked once more at Naledi, sleeping weakly beside the wall. Then toward the wallet hidden beneath his jacket. For one terrible second, he almost changed his mind again. Almost. But finally he inhaled slowly. I'll come today, he whispered. After ending the call, Kerubo grabbed his taxi keys quietly. His hands still trembled, not because returning the wallet was difficult, but because deep inside part of him still desperately wanted to keep it. And that frightened him more than poverty itself. By the time Kerubo Moraa reached Westlands, the morning traffic had already swallowed Nairobi whole. Buses pushed aggressively through crowded roads, while impatient drivers leaned endlessly on their horns. Street vendors moved between vehicles selling newspapers, bottled water, and roasted peanuts beneath the growing heat of the sun. But inside Kerubo's old taxi, everything felt strangely distant. The black wallet resting beside him seemed heavier with every kilometer. Several times during the drive, he almost turned the taxi around. Not because he wanted to steal anymore, but because he feared humiliation. Poor people learned early that wealthy spaces were not built for them. Every expensive building in Nairobi carried invisible signs that said the same thing: you do not belong here. Still, Kerubo kept driving. When Mwangi Group Holdings finally appeared ahead of him, the building looked even larger in daylight. Its towering glass walls reflected the bright morning sun like polished mirrors. Luxury cars filled the parking entrance. Men in expensive suits walked confidently through spinning glass doors, while security guards monitored every movement nearby. Kerubo parked across the street first. For nearly 5 minutes, he remained sitting silently behind the steering wheel. His hands tightened around the wallet. This was the moment. Once he returned it, everything would go back to normal. The debts, the sickness, the fear. No miracle would remain waiting inside black leather anymore. Only suffering again. Kerubo inhaled deeply before stepping out of the taxi. Immediately he became aware of himself. His faded shirt, his worn shoes, the scratches covering his taxi. Compared to the shining corporate tower ahead, he looked invisible, or worse, unwanted. As he crossed the street, several businessmen brushed past him without even looking at his face. A woman wearing sunglasses moved her handbag closer the moment he walked near her. Kerubo lowered his eyes. Poverty carried a smell people pretended not to notice. But he noticed it every day. At the entrance gate, 2 security guards stopped him immediately. "Yes?" one guard asked coldly. Kerubo held the wallet carefully. "I need to see Mr. Daniel Mwangi." Both guards exchanged looks before laughing softly. "You and half the country," the taller guard muttered. "It's important," Kerubo said politely. "He left something in my taxi." The second guard frowned slightly. "What thing?" Kerubo hesitated. "A wallet." The guards looked at each other again. This time their expressions changed completely. "Open it!" the tall guard demanded instantly. Kerubo shook his head carefully. "I only want to return it directly to him." The guard's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "So you stole the boss's wallet?" "No," Kerubo answered immediately. "He forgot it last night." Convenient story. Kerubo felt heat rising inside his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. "I'm telling the truth." One guard extended his hand impatiently. "Give it here. We'll return it." But Kerubo remembered the confidential documents inside. Daniel Mwangi's fearful voice from the taxi still echoed in his mind. "If this leaks tomorrow, everything burns." Something told Kerubo the wallet should reach the billionaire directly. "I'm sorry," he said carefully. "I can only give it to him." The taller guard stepped closer now. "Listen carefully, driver. Important people are working inside this building. You cannot stand here making stories all day." Several employees entering the tower had already begun staring. Kerubo suddenly felt exposed. Humiliated. Like a dirty stain outside a world built for richer people. "I'm not causing trouble," he said quietly. "Then leave." One employee passing nearby glanced at Kerubo's old clothes and laughed openly. "Maybe he already took the money." Another man smirked. These taxi drivers are becoming creative. Kerubo's jaw tightened painfully. For a dangerous moment, shame almost defeated him completely. Maybe Kamau had been right. Maybe rich people truly did not deserve honesty. The guards continued watching him suspiciously. "Last warning," the tall one said. "Leave before we remove you." Kerubo slowly looked down at the wallet in his hands. Inside it was enough money to solve almost every problem crushing his life. Yet here he stood being treated like a criminal simply for returning it. The bitterness nearly overwhelmed him. Slowly he turned away from the building. One step, then another. Perhaps this humiliation itself was the answer. Perhaps fate had already given him permission to walk away. But halfway toward the street, his phone vibrated. "Naledi," Kerubo answered immediately. "Papa?" Her weak voice instantly softened something inside him. "How are you feeling? Tired?" Kerubo closed his eyes briefly. "I'll come see you soon." "Are you working?" "Yes." There was a small silence. Then Naledi spoke softly. "Papa?" "Yes." "You're still a good man, right?" The question froze him completely. Traffic noises faded around him. The guards disappeared. The tower disappeared. Everything disappeared except his daughter's fragile voice through the phone. Kerubo swallowed hard. "Yes," he whispered. Naledi sounded relieved. "Good." Then the call ended. For several seconds, Kerubo stood motionless on the crowded sidewalk. Finally, slowly, he turned back toward the building. The guards groaned immediately when they saw him returning. "You again." Kerubo walked directly toward them this time. I'm not leaving. The taller guard stepped forward angrily. You think this is a joke? No. Kerubo's voice remained calm despite the humiliation burning inside him. I promised myself I would return this wallet to its owner. So I'll wait, the second guard scoffed. For how long? As long as necessary. The guard stared at him in disbelief. Most poor people back down quickly under pressure. But there was something strangely stubborn in Kerubo's tired eyes now. Finally, the second guard sighed heavily. Sit there, then, he muttered, while pointing toward a bench near the gate. But don't cause problems. Kerubo nodded quietly. For the next several hours he waited. Employees came and went constantly. Some ignored him completely. Others whispered while staring openly at his clothes. One receptionist, passing outside, glanced at the wallet and frowned suspiciously. Another worker laughed while buying coffee nearby. Maybe he wants a reward. Or maybe he already stole half. The words stung more than Kerubo wanted to admit. By midday, hunger twisted painfully inside his stomach. But he refused to leave even for food. The wallet remained tightly held in both hands the entire time. Meanwhile, high above him inside the glass tower, another crisis was unfolding. Daniel Mwangi had barely slept. Executives crowded the conference room while tension spread across every face. The documents are missing. One board member whispered nervously. Daniel's expression darkened instantly. Search everywhere again. We already did. Another executive leaned forward carefully. Sir, if those files fall into the wrong hands, I know exactly what happens. Daniel interrupted coldly. Silence filled the room, because everyone understood the danger. The missing documents contained proof of corruption, money laundering, and illegal transfers connected to several powerful executives inside Mwangi Group itself. If exposed publicly, careers would collapse. Arrests would follow. Entire empires could burn. Daniel suddenly stood. Call my driver from last night. We already tried, sir. And no answer yet. Daniel looked toward the massive windows overlooking Nairobi below. Something about the taxi driver stayed in his mind. The quiet dignity, the tired eyes, the silence, for reasons he could not explain. Daniel did not believe the man was a thief. Then suddenly, the conference room door opened. One nervous assistant stepped inside carefully. Sir, Daniel turned sharply. What is it? The assistant hesitated. There's a taxi driver downstairs, refusing to leave. Daniel Mwangi did not answer immediately. He stood beside the conference table, staring at his assistant, while silence spread across the room. Around him, executives exchanged nervous glances, pretending calmness, while panic quietly tightened inside their chests. A taxi driver, Daniel repeated slowly. Yes, sir, the assistant replied carefully. Security says he's been waiting outside for hours. One executive scoffed dismissively. Probably another beggar looking for money. But Daniel's expression did not change. What does he want? The assistant hesitated. He claims you left something in his vehicle. Instantly, the atmosphere inside the conference room shifted. Several faces lost color. One board member adjusted his tie nervously. Another lowered his eyes too quickly. Daniel noticed everything. Describe him, he ordered. Old yellow taxi. Worn clothes. Mid-40s, maybe. The assistant swallowed. Security says he refuses to hand over the item unless it reaches you personally. Daniel's heartbeat slowed strangely. For the first time since morning, a small feeling of relief entered his chest. The driver. The quiet man from the airport. Without another word, Daniel grabbed his jacket. "Sir," one executive interrupted quickly. "The board meeting—" "Wait, but the investors are already—" I said, "Wait." The sharpness in Daniel's voice silenced the room immediately. As he walked toward the elevator, several executives exchanged worried looks once more. Especially Samuel Karanja, the company's chief financial officer, because Samuel knew exactly what was inside that missing wallet. And if Daniel recovered those documents, several powerful men inside Mwangi Group could lose everything. Downstairs, Kerubo Moraa still sat quietly on the bench near the entrance gate. The afternoon sun had become brutal now. Sweat soaked through his faded shirt, while hunger hollowed his stomach painfully. Employees continued passing him without interest, though a few still whispered or laughed openly whenever they noticed the wallet in his hands. One young receptionist approached earlier, carrying coffee. "You're still here?" she asked in disbelief. Kerubo nodded politely. She looked at him carefully. "Why not just leave it with security?" Kerubo glanced toward the towering building. Some things should reach the owner directly. The receptionist studied him strangely for a moment, before walking away silently. Now, several hours later, Kerubo's body felt exhausted. Part of him regretted staying. Another part feared leaving. Then suddenly, the glass doors opened. Security guards straightened immediately. Employees nearby stepped aside. And Daniel Mwangi himself emerged from the building surrounded by assistants and bodyguards. Even outside television screens, the billionaire carried enormous presence. Tall, controlled, impeccably dressed. The kind of man ordinary people instinctively moved aside for. But the moment Daniel saw Kerubo sitting alone beneath the sunlight, his steps slowed. Recognition flashed across his face instantly. "It's you," he said quietly. Kerubo stood up carefully. For several seconds, neither man spoke. The contrast between them was almost painful. One man carried wealth powerful enough to influence governments. The other struggled daily to buy medicine for his daughter. Yet somehow, both looked equally tired. Finally, Kerubo extended the wallet forward with both hands. "You forgot this in my taxi last night." The bodyguards immediately stepped closer, but Daniel lifted one hand, slightly stopping them. Slowly, he took the wallet. His fingers tightened around it almost immediately, because he understood what it contained. Quickly opening it, Daniel checked the contents. Money, cards, documents, everything untouched. Every single thing. For the first time in nearly 24 hours, Daniel exhaled fully, a quiet breath filled with disbelief. "You returned all of it?" he asked softly. Kerubo nodded once. "Yes." Daniel looked back up at him carefully now. Really looked at him. The tired eyes, the worn shoes, the exhaustion hidden beneath dignity. And suddenly, Daniel understood something deeply uncomfortable. This man needed the money. Not wanted, needed. Perhaps more than Daniel himself ever had. "Do you know how much was inside?" Daniel asked. Kerubo gave a faint smile. "Enough to change my life." The honesty of the answer stunned everyone nearby. Even the security guards became silent. Daniel studied him carefully. "Yet you returned it." Kerubo shrugged weakly. "It belongs to you." One executive who had followed downstairs laughed lightly. "Impossible," he muttered. "Nobody returns that kind of money." Kerubo heard him, but he said nothing, because poor people were already used to being treated like suspicious creatures whenever they did something good. Daniel slowly closed the wallet again. Then, without hesitation, he pulled out a thick bundle of cash. "Take this," he said firmly. "You earned it." The amount alone looked enormous, more money than Kerubo usually saw in months. Gasps spread quietly among nearby employees. But to everyone's surprise, Kerubo stepped backward. "No." Daniel frowned slightly. "No. I didn't return the wallet for reward money." The executives stared openly now. One bodyguard even blinked in confusion. Daniel himself seemed genuinely shocked. "Do you understand what you're refusing?" "Yes." Why, Kerubo hesitated briefly. Because the real answer was painful. Because if he touched that money now, after hours of fighting temptation, he feared he might break emotionally in front of strangers. Finally, he spoke quietly. "If honesty only exists when rewards are waiting afterward, then it isn't honesty." The words hit harder than anyone expected. Even Daniel fell silent. Around them, Nairobi traffic continued moving loudly beyond the gates. But inside the entrance area, something strange had happened. A poor taxi driver had just embarrassed wealthy people without even trying. Daniel lowered the money slowly. Then he asked something unexpected. "What's your name?" "Kerubo Moraa." "Do you work every day?" Daniel glanced toward the old yellow taxi parked across the street. The vehicle looked exhausted, like its owner. And suddenly, Daniel remembered something else. The tears inside the taxi the previous night. The silent dignity. The feeling that the driver himself carried hidden pain. "You waited here all day?" Daniel asked. Kerubo nodded. The billionaire looked genuinely disturbed by that realization. "Nobody offered you water food." Kerubo gave another faint shrug. "I'm used to waiting." Those words landed painfully inside Daniel's chest. Because nobody should become used to being ignored. Not like that. One executive stepped forward impatiently. "Sir, the investors are still upstairs." Daniel did not look away from Kerubo. "How much do you earn driving that taxi?" he asked suddenly. Kerubo smiled tiredly. "Not enough." For the first time all day, Daniel almost smiled too. Almost. Then his expression became serious again. "You said the money could change your life." Daniel's voice lowered carefully. "So why didn't you keep it?" Kerubo looked down briefly before answering. "My daughter is sick." Silence. Daniel's face changed immediately. "What happened?" "Heart condition." The words were simple, but exhaustion, fear, and helplessness lived inside them. Daniel stared at the man quietly, then at the untouched wallet in his own hands, and something inside the billionaire shifted unexpectedly. Because for the first time in many years, someone had chosen integrity over survival right in front of him. Not for praise, not for cameras, not for reward, just because it was right. And somehow, that disturbed Daniel more deeply than corruption ever had. Kerubo glanced toward the street anxiously. "I should go," he said quietly. "Traffic officers may tow my taxi." Daniel blinked slightly. After everything that had happened, the man was worried about parking fines. The absurd sadness of it almost hurt. "Wait," Daniel said quickly. But Kerubo had already begun stepping backward politely. "Thank you for the ride last night," he said softly. Then he turned and walked toward his battered taxi beneath the burning Nairobi sun. Daniel remained standing motionless near the entrance, watching, thinking, while around him wealthy executives stared in complete disbelief at the poor driver refusing money and quietly disappearing back into ordinary life. And for reasons Daniel could not fully explain yet, he suddenly knew he would never forget Kerubo Moraa. Daniel Mwangi could not concentrate for the rest of the day. The board meeting continued around him inside the massive conference room overlooking Nairobi. But the voices of investors and executives sounded distant now. Financial reports flashed across giant presentation screens. Lawyers discussed risks. Shareholders argued over numbers. Still, Daniel's mind remained fixed on one image: a poor taxi driver walking away from easy wealth. Even stranger, the man had walked away without bitterness. That disturbed Daniel deeply, because most wealthy men he knew, including himself, had spent years believing everyone had a price. Yet Kerubo Moraa had stood in front of enough money to save his daughter's life and still returned every cent untouched. Daniel sat silently at the head of the long conference table while executives continued speaking around him. Finally, Samuel Karanja cleared his throat carefully. "Sir," Daniel looked up, "we need approval on the transport acquisition before market close." Daniel stared at him for several seconds without responding. Samuel maintained calm eye contact, but sweat had begun forming lightly near his collar. Daniel noticed. He noticed everything lately, especially fear. The missing documents inside the wallet had already confirmed his suspicions that corruption inside Mwangi Group ran deeper than anyone admitted publicly. Money had disappeared through fake contracts, offshore transfers, and hidden shell companies. Someone inside his inner circle had betrayed him, possibly several people. And somehow, in the middle of all that greed, the only honest man Daniel had encountered in days was a struggling taxi driver from Eastlands. "Postpone the decision," Daniel said quietly. Several executives looked surprised. Sir Samuel asked carefully. "I said, postpone it." The room fell silent immediately. Daniel stood slowly. "I'm done for today." Without another word, he walked out. Behind him, tension spread rapidly across the conference room, especially among the men hiding secrets. Later that evening, Daniel sat alone inside his office while Nairobi lights slowly awakened beyond the massive glass windows. The city looked beautiful from above, too beautiful. From this height, poverty disappeared. Hunger disappeared. Suffering disappeared. Only lights remained. Sometimes Daniel hated that. His assistant entered carefully, carrying coffee. "You still haven't gone home, sir." Daniel barely looked up. "Find information on someone for me," the assistant blinked. "Who?" "Kerubo Moraa, the taxi driver." The assistant hesitated slightly. "What kind of information?" "Everything." Within hours, the report arrived. Daniel read it alone in silence. Widower, 1 daughter, hospital debt, taxi loan overdue, rent arrears, several unpaid medical notices. Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair. The numbers hurt to read, because they revealed how close Kerubo lived to complete collapse every single day. One emergency, one missed payment, one broken engine. That was all it would take. Daniel continued reading. Neighbors described Kerubo as quiet and respectful. Local shopkeepers trusted him even when he owed money. One teacher from Naledi school mentioned he often worked 18-hour days to keep his daughter enrolled. Then Daniel noticed another detail. 3 separate neighbors described the same thing. He always helps people even when he has nothing. Daniel stared at the sentence for a long moment. Why Why would someone already drowning still try saving others? The question followed him all night. The next morning, Daniel did something he had not done in years. He left his mansion without bodyguards, without assistance, without luxury cars announcing his arrival. Wearing ordinary clothes and an old cap, he drove a simple vehicle toward Eastlands himself. The deeper he entered the neighborhood, the more uncomfortable he became. Not because of danger, because of memory. Daniel had grown up poor once too. Before wealth erased that life. Before expensive suits and corporate towers separated him from ordinary people. The narrow roads, crowded kiosks, and rusted rooftops awakened parts of himself he rarely allowed to surface anymore. Children played football barefoot beside drainage water. Women carried vegetables through crowded alleyways. Men argued over work opportunities near small shops selling tea and bread. Life here was hard, but real. Daniel parked quietly near a roadside stall after spotting Kerubo's yellow taxi nearby. The vehicle looked worse in daylight. Rust spread along the doors. One headlight was cracked. The tires looked dangerously worn. And yet Kerubo carefully washed the windshield himself with slow concentration, as though the taxi were something precious. Daniel watched from a distance unnoticed. A nearby food vendor suddenly called out. Kerubo looked up. An elderly woman stood beside a small vegetable stand, looking distressed. "My grandson hasn't eaten since yesterday," she whispered apologetically. "Can you pay me next week instead?" Kerubo checked his pocket briefly. Daniel noticed immediately. There was barely any money there. Still, Kerubo nodded. "Give me 2 chapatis and tea." Minutes later, the taxi driver carried the food toward a small boy sitting nearby beneath a wall. The child attacked the food hungrily. Kerubo smiled faintly while watching him eat. Then he quietly drank water instead of buying anything for himself. Daniel stared at the scene in silence. The man truly had almost nothing, yet he still gave. No cameras, no audience, no reward, just instinctive kindness. Something inside Daniel tightened painfully. Across the street, 2 other taxi drivers approached Kerubo. One of them was Kamau. "You're a fool," Kamau muttered loudly enough for Daniel to hear. "Do you know what that reward money could have done?" Kerubo shrugged while wiping the taxi window. "It's finished now." "No." Kamau shook his head angrily. "Your daughter is still sick. Your landlord still wants rent. Nothing is finished." Kerubo remained silent. The second driver sighed heavily. "At least the billionaire should have helped you. He offered money." Kamau scoffed immediately. "And you refused." Kerubo lowered his eyes briefly. "I didn't want pity." Daniel felt those words strike him directly. Not pity, dignity. That was what the man protected yesterday. Not pride, dignity. There was a difference. Kamau shook his head again. "Poverty is killing your brain." But Kerubo only smiled tiredly. "Maybe." Suddenly his phone rang. The moment he answered, Daniel saw fear enter his face instantly. "What happened?" Kerubo asked urgently. A pause. Then his expression darkened completely. "I'm coming now." He ended the call quickly and climbed into the tag. Kamau frowned. Naledi Kerubo nodded once. The hospital. Daniel watched the taxi speed away moments later. Without thinking, he followed. Traffic through Nairobi was brutal, but eventually both vehicles reached the crowded public hospital. Daniel parked farther away and entered quietly behind him. Inside, chaos filled the corridors. Patients overflowed into waiting areas. Families slept on benches. Nurses moved quickly between crowded rooms. Daniel finally spotted Kerubo speaking anxiously with a doctor near the pediatric ward. "She needs treatment immediately," the doctor explained. "I'm trying," Kerubo whispered desperately. "We cannot continue delaying payments forever." "I know." The exhaustion in Kerubo's voice hurt to hear. Daniel remained hidden near the hallway corner while watching the conversation. For the first time in many years, shame entered his chest. Not shame for being wealthy, shame for forgetting what desperation looked like. A few minutes later, Kerubo entered Naledi's room carrying a forced smile. Daniel quietly moved closer until he could see through the partially open doorway. The little girl looked pale against the hospital bed, but the moment she saw her father, she smiled brightly anyway. "Papa." Kerubo sat beside her immediately. "I brought your sweater," he whispered gently. Naledi noticed his tired face instantly. "You didn't eat again." Kerubo laughed softly. "You sound exactly like your mother." The girl smiled weakly. Then she asked something quietly that Daniel would never forget. "Did the rich man get his wallet back?" Kerubo nodded. "Yes." "Good." No bitterness, no regret, just simple goodness. Daniel suddenly looked away because something painful had risen unexpectedly inside his chest. For years, he had surrounded himself with wealthy people obsessed with taking more. More money, more power, more control. Yet the poorest father he had met possessed more integrity than all of them combined. And standing there quietly, outside the hospital room, Daniel Mwangi realized something else too. He no longer wanted Kerubo Moraa to remain a stranger. 3 days after the hospital visit, strange things began happening around Kerubo Moraa's life. At first, he thought they were coincidences, small things, impossible things. The first happened at the garage near Eastlands, where he usually repaired his taxi. Kerubo had brought the vehicle there early that morning after the engine nearly failed again during traffic. Smoke had started leaking from beneath the hood, and every strange sound from the taxi now felt like another threat waiting to destroy his life completely. The mechanic Otieno spent nearly an hour checking the engine before finally wiping grease from his hands. "It's bad," he muttered. "Very bad." Kerubo sighed tiredly. "How much?" Otieno named an amount that immediately crushed him. Kerubo lowered his head. "I don't have it." "I know." The mechanic looked genuinely sorry. "But if you keep driving like this, the engine will die completely." Kerubo stared silently at the cracked concrete floor. Another problem. Another wall. Another reminder that poverty never rested. "Give me 2 more days," he whispered. Otieno frowned strangely. 2 days? For what? To find money. The mechanic blinked in confusion before walking toward his small office table. After searching through papers for a moment, he returned, holding a receipt. Kerubo. Someone already paid. Kerubo looked up sharply. "What the repairs?" Otieno shrugged. "Cash payment. Early this morning." Kerubo froze completely. "Who paid a man?" Otieno scratched his chin. Tall, wore a cap, didn't give his name. Kerubo's stomach tightened instantly. "Are you sure?" Otieno handed him the receipt. "Everything's covered." For several seconds, Kerubo could only stare at the paper in disbelief. Nothing in his life was ever simply covered. Not rent, not food, not medicine, certainly not repairs. This must be a mistake, he said slowly. Otieno shook his head. No mistake. Kerubo immediately thought about Daniel Mwangi. But why would a billionaire secretly repair a taxi instead of helping openly? The question followed him the entire day. Then something even stranger happened. That afternoon, Kerubo arrived at the hospital expecting another argument about unpaid bills. Instead, the nurse greeted him differently, almost warmly. "Mr. Moraa," she said, while checking files, "your payment extension was approved." Kerubo frowned. "Approved?" "Yes." "By who?" The nurse looked confused. "It came from administration this morning." Kerubo felt uneasiness rising slowly inside him. "How many extra days?" The nurse smiled softly. "A month. A month." No threats. No pressure. No warnings. For the first time in weeks, Naledi's treatment could continue without immediate fear. Kerubo stood speechless beside the desk. "Is something wrong?" the nurse asked gently. "No," he whispered slowly. "I just don't understand." When he entered Naledi's room afterward, she immediately noticed something different in his face. "What happened?" Kerubo forced a small smile. "The hospital gave us more time." Naledi's eyes widened. "Really?" "Yes." She smiled weakly before reaching for his hand. "See, God is helping us." Kerubo smiled back, but confusion still sat heavily inside his chest. Because miracles did not usually visit people like him twice in 1 week. That evening, after finishing work, Kerubo returned home exhausted. But another surprise waited outside his apartment building. His landlord, Mrs. Akinyi, stood near the entrance holding paperwork. Normally, seeing her meant trouble. "Kerubo," she called out. Instantly, he prepared himself. "I know about the rent," he said quickly. "Please, just give me a little more." "I already did." He blinked. "What?" She folded her arms. "A man came this afternoon and paid part of your balance." Kerubo stared at her. Again, the same strange feeling spread through him. "What man I don't know." She shrugged. Tall, expensive watch, spoke politely. Daniel Mwangi. It had to be him. No one else even knew about Kerubo's struggles. Anger suddenly mixed with gratitude inside him. Why would a billionaire secretly interfere in his life like this? Was it kindness? Pity? Charity? Kerubo hated charity. Not because he was proud, because charity often came with invisible humiliation attached to it. Poor people learned quickly that some wealthy people gave help only to feel powerful afterward. Later that night, Kerubo parked beside a roadside tea stall with Kamau and 2 other taxi drivers. "You look less miserable today," Kamau joked while sipping tea. Kerubo hesitated briefly before explaining the strange events. The repaired taxi, the hospital extension, the rent payment. Kamau immediately laughed loudly. "The billionaire likes you." Kerubo frowned. "I don't want that." "You don't want help?" "I don't want pity." Kamau shook his head in disbelief. "Brother, poverty is not dignity. If rich people finally help you accept it." Kerubo stared quietly into his tea. "It feels wrong." "Why?" "Because tomorrow they can remind you they saved your life." The older drivers nearby nodded silently. They understood. Many poor people preferred suffering quietly over becoming someone's public charity story. Kamau leaned closer. "Listen carefully. There are 2 types of rich people. ones who help to control you, and ones who help because they still remember pain. Kerubo thought about Daniel's face in the taxi that night. The tears, the exhaustion, the loneliness. Maybe Kamau was right. Maybe the billionaire was not trying to humiliate him. Still, something about the situation felt dangerous now. Too much attention, too much mystery. Meanwhile, across the city, inside Mwangi Group headquarters, tension was becoming unbearable. Daniel sat alone in his office reviewing financial files while rain clouds gathered slowly over Nairobi outside. The recovered documents from the wallet had confirmed everything he feared. Millions had disappeared through fake transport contracts connected to executives inside his own company. Names, signatures, bank accounts, betrayal hidden behind expensive smiles. Daniel's jaw tightened. Someone close to him had spent years stealing while pretending loyalty. A knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in." Samuel Karanja entered carefully. "Still working late?" Samuel asked lightly. Daniel closed the file slowly. "Yes." Samuel studied him for a moment. "You've seemed distracted lately." Daniel leaned back calmly. "Should I not be?" Samuel smiled faintly. "Business pressure." "No." Daniel's eyes sharpened slightly. "Something else." For a brief second, tension flickered across Samuel's face. Then it disappeared. "Is this about the missing wallet?" Daniel watched him carefully now. "Yes." Samuel forced a small laugh. "At least you got it back." Daniel remained silent. Too silent. The CFO adjusted his tie again. Finally, he spoke carefully. "Who returned it?" "A taxi driver." Samuel nodded slowly. "And you trust him?" The question sounded casual, but Daniel heard the hidden meaning beneath it. More importantly, he noticed fear again. Tiny signs. Too controlled. Too careful. Daniel answered quietly, "I trust him more than some executives in this building." Samuel's smile disappeared completely. Later that same night, another man entered Samuel's office privately after most employees had gone home. "What now?" the visitor whispered nervously. Samuel walked toward the window overlooking Nairobi lights. "The driver is becoming a problem. He only returned the wallet." "Yes." Samuel's voice hardened. "And now Daniel is asking too many questions." The visitor swallowed nervously. "What do we do?" Samuel remained silent for several moments. Then finally he spoke coldly. "Find out everything about Kerubo Moraa." Back in Eastlands, unaware of the danger slowly growing around him, Kerubo finished his final passenger ride and began driving home through the dark Nairobi streets. Traffic had become lighter now. Rain clouds covered the city sky. At a red light, Kerubo suddenly noticed something strange in his rearview mirror. A black SUV behind him. It had been there for several turns already. At first, he ignored it. But when he turned into another narrow road, the vehicle followed again. A cold feeling slowly crept into his chest. Kerubo drove faster. The SUV remained behind him, steady, silent, watching. And for the first time since returning the wallet, real fear entered his heart. Kerubo Moraa drove through the dark Nairobi streets with growing uneasiness tightening inside his chest. The black SUV behind him still had not turned away. Every time he changed lanes, it followed. Every time he slowed near traffic lights, it slowed too. Kerubo gripped the steering wheel harder. At first, he tried convincing himself it meant nothing. Nairobi roads were crowded at night. Hundreds of cars moved through the city at every hour. But deep inside, instinct warned him otherwise. The SUV was watching him. Cold sweat formed lightly along his neck. He glanced again through the mirror. Dark windows. No visible faces. No headlights flashing. Just silent pursuit. Kerubo suddenly turned sharply into a narrow side road lined with small kiosks and apartment buildings. Normally, drivers heading toward the highway never use that route. Still, seconds later, the SUV turned too. Fear spread fully through him now. His first thought was Naledi. If something happened to him, who would protect her? Kerubo accelerated carefully, weaving through motorcycles and late-night pedestrians. His old taxi rattled violently beneath the pressure, the damaged engine groaning angrily. "Come on," he whispered desperately to the car. The SUV remained behind him, steady, patient, like hunters already confident the animal could not escape. Finally, Kerubo spotted a crowded petrol station ahead. Without hesitation, he pulled inside sharply between buses and motorcycles. The SUV slowed near the entrance. Then, after several tense seconds, it continued driving past without stopping. Gone. Kerubo exhaled shakily. His entire shirt was damp with sweat. For nearly a minute, he remained parked beside the fuel pumps, trying to calm his breathing. Maybe it had been coincidence after all. Maybe fear was beginning to poison his mind. Still, when he finally drove home later that night, he checked his mirrors constantly the entire way. The next morning brought another problem. Kerubo arrived at his usual taxi stage near downtown Nairobi, only to find several drivers staring at him strangely. Kamau approached first. "What happened now?" Kerubo asked tiredly. Kamau held up his phone silently. "Look." Kerubo frowned and took the device. An online gossip page filled the screen. The headline made his stomach drop instantly. "Taxi driver linked to billionaire CEO mystery." Below it was a blurry photograph of Kerubo standing outside Mwangi Group headquarters holding Daniel's wallet. The article twisted everything cruelly. It claimed the poor driver had secretly blackmailed Daniel Mwangi after finding sensitive corporate information. Anonymous sources suggested the billionaire paid him quietly to avoid scandal. Hundreds of comments flooded beneath the article. Poor people always become greedy. He probably stole money first. Why would a billionaire help some random driver? Something dirty is happening. Kerubo felt his chest tightening painfully. "This is nonsense," he whispered. Kamau nodded grimly. "It's spreading everywhere." Another driver nearby shook his head. "Brother Rich, people's problems destroy ordinary men." Kerubo returned the phone slowly. Humiliation burned through him. He had done the right thing. So why did honesty suddenly feel like punishment? Before he could even process the situation, his phone rang. Unknown number. Kerubo answered cautiously. "Hello? This is Nairobi Transport Licensing Office." His stomach tightened instantly. "Yes, we need you to report to our office immediately regarding complaints filed against your taxi operations. Complaints, your license is temporarily suspended pending investigation." Kerubo's face lost color. "What investigation?" "You'll receive details upon arrival." The call ended. Kamau immediately understood something was wrong. "What happened?" Kerubo lowered the phone slowly. "They suspended my taxi license." Silence spread among the drivers. Everyone understood what that meant. Without the taxi, Kerubo had no income. No income meant no medicine, no rent, no food, nothing. Kamal cursed under his breath. This isn't random anymore. Deep down, Kerubo knew it too. Somebody was targeting him deliberately now. Meanwhile, inside Mwangi Group headquarters, Daniel Mwangi slammed his office desk so hard that papers scattered across the floor. Who released this story? He demanded furiously. No one answered immediately. His media advisor looked terrified. We're still investigating, sir. Daniel grabbed the printed article angrily. They're calling him a criminal. We can issue a statement. Yes. Daniel's voice hardened dangerously. Immediately. Across the room, Samuel Karanja remained carefully silent. Too silent. Daniel noticed. Again. Sir Samuel finally said calmly, "Public attention will fade if we avoid overreacting." Daniel turned slowly toward him. "A poor man returned millions untouched," he said coldly. "Now someone destroys his life for it. And you call that overreacting?" Samuel lowered his eyes briefly. "Of course not." Daniel studied him carefully again. The fear was becoming more visible now. That alone told Daniel enough. Later that afternoon, Kerubo stood inside the crowded transport office holding suspension papers with shaking hands. The clerk barely looked at him. "Next." Kerubo frowned. "That's all." The woman shrugged impatiently. "Your case is under review. But I didn't do anything." She pointed toward the paperwork. "Complaints were filed." "By who? I don't know." Kerubo stared helplessly at the papers. No taxi operation until further notice. His entire body suddenly felt heavy. Outside the office building, Nairobi traffic roared endlessly beneath the afternoon heat. People hurried past carrying briefcases, groceries, phones, and food containers. Life continued normally. But for Kerubo, the world had just shifted again. Slowly, he sat on a nearby bench and lowered his head into his hands. What now? How would he explain this to Naledi? How would they survive another disaster? His phone vibrated suddenly. Hospital. Fear stabbed through him instantly. Kerubo answered immediately. "Mr. Moraa," the nurse sounded urgent. "Naledi collapsed during treatment." Everything inside him froze. "What you need to come quickly." Kerubo ran. He barely remembered crossing streets or climbing onto crowded buses afterward. The city blurred around him completely. By the time he reached the hospital, his lungs burned painfully. He rushed through crowded corridors until he saw doctors surrounding Naledi's bed. Machines beeped rapidly nearby. His daughter looked frighteningly pale. "What happened?" he asked desperately. The doctor turned toward him gravely. "She became unstable this morning." Kerubo grabbed the bed rail tightly. "No. We managed to stabilize her for now, but she needs more advanced treatment soon." The words crushed him instantly, because he already knew what came next. Money. Always money. The doctor hesitated carefully. "Mr. Moraa, the payment situation is becoming serious again." Kerubo closed his eyes painfully. Just yesterday there had been hope. Today everything collapsed again. A nurse quietly handed him updated medical papers. The numbers looked impossible. Kerubo sat slowly beside Naledi's bed while exhaustion consumed him completely. His daughter opened her eyes weakly moments later. "Papa." He grabbed her hand immediately. "I'm here." Naledi tried smiling faintly, but even smiling now looked difficult. "You're crying," she whispered softly. Only then did Kerubo realize tears were falling down his face. He turned away quickly. Outside the hospital room window, evening darkness slowly covered Nairobi once more. And somewhere in the city, powerful men continued destroying the life of the poor taxi driver who had simply chosen honesty. Kerubo Moraa spent the entire night beside Naledi's hospital bed. The small room remained dim and quiet except for the soft sound of medical machines and distant footsteps moving through the hallway outside. Naledi slept weakly beneath a thin blanket while Kerubo sat beside her, holding her hand carefully, afraid even movement itself might disturb her fragile body. Exhaustion covered him completely now. His taxi license was suspended. Online gossip pages continued spreading lies. Debt collectors still called endlessly. And somewhere in Nairobi, unknown men were watching him. All because he returned a wallet. Kerubo stared down at his daughter's sleeping face and felt something dangerous growing inside him. Bitterness. For the first time since this nightmare began, he questioned whether honesty had truly been worth it. Around midnight, a doctor entered quietly carrying updated medical charts. Kerubo stood immediately. "How is she?" The doctor sighed heavily. "She's stable for now, but she needs transfer to a better cardiac facility soon." Kerubo already knew what that meant. More money. Always more money. "I'm trying," he whispered tiredly. The doctor looked sympathetic. "I know, but sympathy never paid hospital bills." After the doctor left, Kerubo slowly sat again. Then suddenly, movement near the doorway caught his attention. A tall figure stood outside the room. Daniel Mwangi. For a brief moment, both men simply stared at each other silently. The billionaire wore ordinary clothes again, instead of expensive suits, but his presence still filled the hallway naturally. Behind him stood no cameras, no bodyguards, no assistants, only concern. Kerubo's expression hardened instantly. "What are you doing here?" Daniel stepped inside slowly. "I came to see how your daughter is doing." Kerubo stood fully now. "You shouldn't be here." Daniel glanced toward Naledi, sleeping weakly on the bed. "I heard she collapsed." Kerubo's jaw tightened. "And whose fault is that?" The question hit sharply. Daniel looked back at him quietly. "You think I wanted this? I think my life was peaceful before I met you." The words carried exhaustion more than anger. Still, they hurt. Daniel remained silent for several seconds. Then he spoke carefully. "The articles online were not from me, but they happened because of you. I'm trying to fix it." Kerubo laughed bitterly under his breath. "Fix it!" His voice lowered immediately so he would not wake Naledi. "My taxi license is gone. People call me a criminal. Men are following me at night." He stared directly at Daniel now. "My daughter nearly died today." Daniel absorbed every word quietly. "Because none of them were lies." "I'm sorry," he said softly. Kerubo shook his head immediately. "Rich people always say sorry after damage is already done." The billionaire's face changed slightly at that. Not anger, pain. "You think money protects people from suffering," Daniel said quietly. "It doesn't." Kerubo stared at him coldly. "No. It just protects you from starving while you suffer." Silence filled the hospital room again. Daniel looked exhausted suddenly, older, somehow. Finally, he pulled a chair quietly beside the wall and sat down. "I grew up poor," he said unexpectedly. Kerubo frowned slightly but said nothing. My mother sold vegetables beside a roadside market in Kisumu. Some nights we slept hungry. Daniel looked down briefly. When I was 12, she collapsed while working because she hadn't eaten properly in days. Kerubo's expression softened only slightly. Daniel continued quietly. I promised myself then that I would become rich enough to never feel helpless again. And did it work? Daniel gave a faint, humorless smile. For a while, the hospital lights reflected tiredly across his face now. Then the company became bigger, more powerful, more complicated. He exhaled slowly. Eventually, I stopped recognizing the people around me. Kerubo crossed his arms carefully. So now you help poor people to feel better about yourself. The question landed harder than intended. Daniel looked directly at him. No. Then why? For several seconds, the billionaire did not answer. Finally, quietly, he said the truth. Because you reminded me of the man I used to be before money changed my world. The honesty of the answer caught Kerubo off guard. Before he could respond, Naledi stirred weakly on the bed. Her eyes opened slowly. Papa Kerubo immediately moved beside her. I'm here. Naledi blinked sleepily toward Daniel. Recognition appeared faintly on her face. The wallet man, she whispered weakly. Daniel almost smiled. Yes. Naledi looked between both men carefully. Are you fighting? Neither answered immediately. Finally, Kerubo sighed tiredly. No. The little girl studied Daniel quietly for a moment. Then she asked softly, Did you lose your wallet again? To Kerubo's surprise, Daniel laughed quietly. A real laugh. Small, tired, human. No, he said gently. Good. Naledi relaxed slightly against the pillow again. Daniel looked at her carefully. She's strong. Kerubo nodded once. She gets that from her mother. For the first time since entering the room, silence between both men no longer felt hostile. Just heavy. Real. Daniel eventually stood slowly. I spoke to hospital administration already. Kerubo's face hardened again immediately. No. Daniel paused. She needs treatment. I said no. This isn't charity. Then what is it? Daniel looked at Naledi sleeping weakly once more before answering. A father helping another father. Kerubo looked away instantly, because those words struck somewhere painful inside him. Still, pride remained stubborn. I can take care of my daughter. Daniel nodded slowly. I know you can. Then stop interfering in my life. The billionaire hesitated briefly. Then he spoke carefully. Men inside my company are dangerous, Kerubo. The moment you returned that wallet, you became connected to something bigger than you realize. Kerubo frowned. What does that mean? It means the people attacking you are afraid. Afraid of what Daniel's expression darkened. The documents inside that wallet expose corruption worth millions. Slowly understanding entered Kerubo's face. So this is all about money. Yes, always money. Daniel did not disagree, because he knew it was true. Kerubo rubbed his tired face slowly. I don't want problems with rich people. You already have them. That silence afterward felt heavier than everything before it. Finally, Daniel reached into his pocket and placed a business card carefully beside the hospital bed. If anything happens, he said quietly, call me directly. Kerubo looked at the card, but did not touch it. Daniel turned toward the doorway. Then he stopped one final time. You told me something "Outside my building," he said softly, without turning around. "You said a rich man without peace is poorer than you." Kerubo remained silent. Daniel nodded faintly to himself. "I think you were right." Then the billionaire walked quietly out of the hospital room and disappeared into the dim hallway beyond. Kerubo stared at the untouched business card for a very long time afterward. Part of him still distrusted everything about wealthy men, but another part had finally seen something unexpected tonight. Loneliness, not power, not arrogance. Loneliness. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Kerubo realized Daniel Mwangi might be just as trapped by his world as poor people were trapped by theirs. The days that followed changed something quietly between Kerubo Moraa and Daniel Mwangi. Not friendship, not yet. But the anger between them softened into cautious understanding. Daniel began visiting the hospital more often, though always without cameras or media attention. Sometimes he arrived late at night carrying food for Naledi. Other times he simply sat silently near the hallway while doctors updated him on her condition. Kerubo still distrusted wealth. That had not changed. But slowly he began realizing Daniel's presence felt different from the rich men he had known before. There was no arrogance, no performance, no desire to be praised, only exhaustion. One evening, Kerubo found Daniel sitting alone outside the pediatric ward, staring at the city lights beyond the hospital windows. "You came again," Kerubo said quietly. Daniel looked up. "How is she?" "Better today." The billionaire nodded with visible relief. For several moments, neither man spoke. Then Daniel glanced toward Kerubo's hands. "You're still driving without the license issue resolved?" Kerubo leaned against the wall tiredly. "I have no choice." "That's dangerous. So is hunger." Daniel looked away because he could not argue with that. Kerubo studied him carefully now. "You really grew up poor," Daniel gave a faint smile. "You still don't believe me. You don't look like someone who remembers suffering." The billionaire became quiet for a moment. Then he spoke softly. "My mother used to wake up at 4 every morning to fry mandazi beside the road." His eyes remained fixed on the city outside. "Some nights, drunk men insulted her while she worked. Some days, police chased vendors away and destroyed their stalls." Kerubo listened silently. Daniel continued. "I hated those days. I hated watching her beg customers to buy food." His jaw tightened slightly. "So I promised myself I would become powerful enough that nobody could ever humiliate us again." "And you succeeded." "Yes. But you still look unhappy." That made Daniel laugh softly under his breath. "A company becomes another kind of prison after a while." Kerubo frowned slightly. "How?" "Everyone around you wants something." Daniel's expression darkened. "Money, influence, access. Even kindness becomes suspicious." Kerubo understood that feeling better than expected. Because poverty created the same loneliness differently. People either pitied you or used you. Very few simply saw you. Suddenly, Naledi's laughter echoed softly from inside the room. Both men turned instinctively. The little girl sat awake while a nurse adjusted her blanket. Daniel smiled faintly. "She sounds stronger. She likes when visitors bring fruit," Kerubo admitted quietly. Daniel almost smiled again. "I noticed." For the first time, silence between them felt almost peaceful. But elsewhere in Nairobi, other men were growing increasingly nervous. Inside a private office at Mwangi Group headquarters Samuel Karanja slammed a newspaper onto his desk angrily. Another article about the mysterious taxi driver had appeared online that morning. This time, public sympathy was beginning to shift toward Kerubo. One journalist questioned why such a poor man would risk everything to return money if he truly intended blackmail. Too many questions were appearing now. Too much attention. "We should have handled him earlier," Samuel muttered coldly. The man sitting across from him frowned nervously. "What if Daniel already suspects us?" Samuel's eyes sharpened dangerously. "He suspects everyone." The room became silent. Then the second man spoke, carefully. "The driver is becoming close to him." Samuel's jaw tightened. That part disturbed him most. Daniel Mwangi rarely trusted people emotionally anymore. Yet somehow the taxi driver had entered spaces executives could no longer reach. "That cannot continue," Samuel said quietly. Meanwhile, unaware of the conversation happening elsewhere, Kerubo spent more time at the hospital than on the road now. The taxi license suspension still remained unresolved, and work had become irregular. Some customers refused entering his vehicle after recognizing him from online gossip pages. Others stared suspiciously. A few openly insulted him. One man even stepped out midway through a ride after recognizing Kerubo's face online. "I don't ride with criminals," he snapped before slamming the door. Kerubo said nothing. Humiliation had become familiar. But each insult still left invisible bruises behind. That afternoon, after another failed attempt to resolve his taxi license, Kerubo returned to the hospital carrying a small paper bag of oranges for Naledi. As he approached the room, he suddenly stopped. Daniel sat beside Naledi's bed, helping her solve a school mathematics problem. The billionaire looked strangely relaxed, human. Naledi noticed her father first. Papa Kerubo entered slowly. Daniel looked up. "She's smarter than I was at her age," he admitted. Naledi grinned proudly. Kerubo placed the oranges beside the bed. "You're giving my daughter too much confidence. She deserves it." The simple answer lingered quietly in the room. Then Naledi suddenly asked something unexpected. "Mr. Daniel?" "Yes." "Are you rich?" Daniel blinked. Kerubo almost laughed despite himself. "What kind of question is that?" Naledi ignored him completely. Daniel smiled faintly. "I suppose so." The little girl thought carefully. "Then why do you still look sad sometimes?" Silence. Even Kerubo looked surprised. Children saw truths adults buried carefully. Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair. "That's complicated." Naledi frowned slightly. "Money is supposed to make people happy." Kerubo lowered his eyes quietly, because once long ago he had believed that too. Daniel looked toward the hospital window. "It makes life easier," he admitted softly. "But easier and happier are not always the same thing." Naledi considered the answer seriously before nodding slowly as though accepting wisdom far older than her years. Later that evening, Daniel left the hospital after speaking briefly with doctors about Naledi's condition. But as he walked toward the parking lot, his phone rang. It was his private investigator. "I found something," the man said quietly. Daniel stopped walking instantly. "What financial transfers connected to Samuel Karanja?" Daniel's face hardened. "How bad vary?" The investigator lowered his voice further. "And there's something else." Daniel listened carefully. "We intercepted messages discussing Kerubo Moraa." A cold feeling entered Daniel's chest immediately. What kind of messages? Threat assessment. Silence. Then Daniel's voice dropped dangerously low. "Explain. They're watching him." For several seconds, Daniel said nothing. Cars moved quietly through the hospital parking lot around him while darkness covered Nairobi beyond the gates. Finally, he spoke again. "Does Kerubo know?" Number Daniel looked back toward the hospital building where the poor taxi driver still sat beside his daughter, completely unaware of the danger surrounding him. Then the investigator said one final sentence that changed everything. "Someone inside your company ordered surveillance on him 2 days ago." Daniel ended the call slowly. His jaw tightened hard enough to ache, because now it was no longer only about corruption. Kerubo Moraa was becoming a target. And for the first time since taking over Mwangi Group, Daniel realized the people around him might be far more dangerous than he originally believed. 2 nights later, Nairobi felt unusually cold. A strong wind moved through the streets, while dark clouds covered the city sky. Most people hurried home early, avoiding the heavy weather gathering above the roads. Kerubo Moraa left the hospital shortly after visiting hours ended. Naledi had finally fallen asleep peacefully after a difficult day of treatment, and for the first time in weeks, the doctor sounded slightly hopeful about her condition. Still, hope frightened Kerubo now, because every time life seemed to improve, something terrible followed immediately afterward. As he walked toward the hospital parking area, Daniel's warning echoed again inside his mind. "They're watching you." At first, Kerubo had dismissed the billionaire's fears as corporate paranoia. But lately, too many strange things had happened. The SUV following him, the online attacks, the suspended taxi license, none of it felt accidental anymore. Kerubo unlocked his old taxi and sat behind the steering wheel quietly for a moment before starting the engine. The hospital parking lot was nearly empty now. Rain began falling lightly against the windshield. He sighed tiredly. All he wanted was one peaceful night without fear. But life no longer seemed interested in peace. The taxi engine struggled briefly before finally starting. Kerubo drove slowly out of the parking lot and onto the main road leading toward Eastlands. Traffic remained thin because of the weather. Neon shop signs reflected across wet roads while buses sprayed dirty water beside smaller vehicles. For several minutes, everything seemed normal. Then headlights appeared suddenly behind him. A motorcycle. 2 men. Kerubo's grip tightened immediately. The motorcycle remained close. Too close. At the next intersection, Kerubo turned sharply. The motorcycle followed. Fear returned instantly. Not coincidence. Not imagination. Real danger. Kerubo accelerated, but his old taxi responded slowly. The damaged engine groaned loudly beneath the pressure while rain intensified across the windshield. The motorcycle moved closer. One rider shouted something lost beneath traffic noise. Kerubo's heart pounded violently. He turned again toward a narrower road filled with apartment blocks and roadside shops. The motorcycle still followed. Then suddenly, bang! Something slammed violently against the side of the taxi. Kerubo flinched hard. Another impact followed, immediately against the rear window. The riders were attacking the vehicle. "God," he whispered. One man on the motorcycle pulled something metallic from beneath his jacket. Panic exploded through Kerubo completely. Without thinking, he swerved sharply between 2 buses and sped toward a crowded market street ahead. People shouted angrily as the taxi nearly clipped roadside stalls. The motorcycle struggled to follow through the chaos. Then suddenly, another loud crash erupted behind him. The taxi jerked violently sideways. A tire! One of the tires had blown. Kerubo fought desperately to control the vehicle as it skidded across wet pavement. The taxi slammed hard into a roadside barrier with terrifying force. Glass shattered, metal screamed. Everything blurred violently. For several seconds, silence swallowed the world completely. Then pain arrived. Sharp, blinding. Kerubo groaned weakly against the steering wheel while rainwater leaked slowly through the cracked windshield onto his face. His head throbbed painfully. Blood trickled down one side of his forehead. Outside, frightened pedestrians gathered nearby, shouting loudly. The motorcycle was gone, vanished, like ghosts disappearing into darkness. "Are you alive?" someone yelled while pulling at the damaged taxi door. Kerubo tried answering, but pain crushed the words inside his chest. The door finally opened. Several men carefully helped him out of the wrecked vehicle, while rain poured heavily around them now. His taxi looked destroyed. The front bumper hung twisted sideways. One headlight shattered completely. Steam rose from beneath the crushed hood. Kerubo stared at the damage weakly. The taxi, his last lifeline, gone. Something inside him broke quietly at that moment. Not loudly, not dramatically, just exhaustion finally becoming too heavy to carry anymore. Hours later, after receiving stitches at a nearby clinic, Kerubo sat alone outside beneath a small metal shelter while rain continued falling across Nairobi. His body hurt. His hands still trembled. But worse than the physical pain was the crushing realization that he had nothing left now. No stable income, no functioning taxi, no protection. And still, Naledi remained inside a hospital needing treatment he could barely afford. His phone suddenly vibrated. Daniel Mwangi. Kerubo stared at the screen for several seconds before answering. "What happened?" Daniel asked immediately. Kerubo frowned weakly. "How do you know something happened?" "My investigator lost sight of you near the market area." Daniel's voice sounded tense now. "Where are you?" For a moment, pride almost made Kerubo lie. But exhaustion defeated pride tonight. "My taxi is destroyed." Silence. Then Daniel spoke again sharply. "Are you hurt?" "I'm alive." "Location." Kerubo hesitated, then finally gave the address quietly. Less than 30 minutes later, black headlights appeared through the rain. Daniel stepped out of an SUV and immediately froze at the sight of Kerubo sitting bloodied beneath the shelter. Anger crossed the billionaire's face instantly. "Jesus." Kerubo looked away. "I'm fine." "No, you're not." Daniel crouched slightly to inspect the stitches near his forehead. "Did you see their faces?" Kerubo shook his head slowly. "Two men on a motorcycle." Daniel's jaw tightened dangerously. He already knew exactly what this meant. "They're escalating," he muttered quietly. Kerubo laughed bitterly despite the pain. "All this because I returned a wallet." Rain hammered loudly around them. Daniel stared toward the destroyed taxi nearby. Then back at Kerubo. "This is my fault." "No." Kerubo's voice remained tired but firm. "This is the fault of rich men destroying each other with money." Daniel looked down silently because he could not deny it. For several moments, neither spoke. Finally, Kerubo whispered something that sounded almost broken. "I'm tired." The words hit harder than shouting ever could. Not angry, not dramatic, just defeated. Daniel slowly sat beside him beneath the shelter. "I know." "No, you don't." The billionaire looked toward the rain-covered streets ahead. "Yes?" he said softly. "I do." Kerubo laughed weakly again. You still have power. And you still have peace I lost years ago. Kerubo turned toward him sharply. What peace? Daniel met his eyes quietly. The kind that lets a poor man return money even while suffering. The rain softened slightly around them. Kerubo stared down at his injured hands. Then, for the first time since Wanjiru died, tears finally escaped him completely. Not hidden tears, not silent tears, real ones. Years of exhaustion poured out quietly beneath the cold Nairobi rain. I'm trying so hard, he whispered brokenly. I swear I'm trying. Daniel said nothing. He simply sat beside him while the poor taxi driver cried for the first time in years, because sometimes dignity becomes too heavy for one human being to carry alone. And in that moment, beneath flickering streetlights and endless rain, Daniel Mwangi finally understood the true cost of the honesty Kerubo Moraa had chosen. By morning, Daniel Mwangi had made his decision. He was done hiding. For years, he had tolerated corruption inside Mwangi Group because exposing it threatened the company's stability, investor trust, and public image. Every powerful businessman in Nairobi understood the same ugly truth. Large corporations survive partly because people ignored certain sins. But now innocent people were suffering. Kerubo's destroyed taxi, Naledi's worsening condition, the attacks, the surveillance. Daniel could no longer pretend the danger would disappear quietly. Someone inside his company had crossed a line, and he intended to destroy them publicly. Inside his office that morning, tension filled the air heavily. Several executives sat around the conference table while Daniel reviewed financial documents silently. No one spoke unless necessary, because everyone sensed something changing inside him, especially Samuel Karanja. The CFO watched Daniel carefully throughout the meeting, too carefully. Finally, Daniel closed the file in front of him. We're holding a shareholders meeting tomorrow afternoon. The room looked surprised. So suddenly one executive asked, Yes. Samuel adjusted his tie slightly. What's the purpose? Daniel met his eyes calmly. To discuss internal corruption. Silence. Pure silence. Even the air inside the room seemed to tighten. One executive laughed nervously. Corruption? Daniel slid several documents across the table. Unauthorized transfers, fake contracts, offshore accounts. Nobody touched the papers immediately. Samuel's face remained controlled, but Daniel noticed the faintest twitch near his jaw. Surely, Samuel said carefully, we should investigate privately before alarming shareholders. Daniel leaned back slowly. I already investigated privately. Another silence followed. Then Daniel stood. Tomorrow, everything becomes public. He walked out without another word. The moment the office doors closed behind him, panic spread across the room instantly. Later that afternoon, Daniel met privately with his investigator in a secure office downtown. Tell me everything Daniel ordered. The investigator placed photographs across the desk. Images of Samuel Karanja meeting secretly with shell company directors. Bank transfers, private accounts, luxury property purchases hidden overseas. Daniel stared coldly at the evidence. How many executives are involved? At least 4. And the attacks on Kerubo. The investigator hesitated. We still cannot directly connect Samuel to the motorcycle men. He lowered his voice slightly. But surveillance records place company security contractors near Kerubo's neighborhood twice this week. Daniel's expression darkened dangerously. That was enough for him. Tomorrow, he said quietly, I end this. Meanwhile, across Nairobi, Kerubo Moraa sat beside Naledi's bed, helping her finish school exercises from home. His injuries still hurt badly. The stitches near his forehead throbbed constantly, and every movement reminded him of the crash. Worse still, the remains of his taxi now sat abandoned near a garage too damaged to repair cheaply. Without the vehicle, he had almost nothing left. Still, Naledi smiled more today. And that mattered more than pain. You're writing too fast, Kerubo teased gently while watching her solve mathematics problems. Naledi frowned dramatically. My teacher says fast thinking is intelligence. Kerubo laughed softly. Your teacher has never seen your father trying to count hospital bills. The little girl giggled weakly. For a moment, life almost felt normal again. Then Kerubo's phone vibrated, unknown number. He answered cautiously. Hello, a male voice spoke quietly. If you care about your daughter, stay away from Daniel Mwangi. Kerubo froze instantly. Who is this? You were warned already. The line disconnected immediately. Fear spread through him like ice water. Naledi noticed his expression at once. Papa Kerubo forced a smile quickly. Nothing. But inside panic had already exploded. They knew about Naledi. That changed everything. Hours later, Daniel arrived at the hospital carrying fruit and paperwork. But the moment he entered the room, he immediately sensed something wrong. Kerubo looked pale, distracted. What happened? Kerubo hesitated briefly, then handed him the phone. Daniel listened silently as the recorded voicemail replayed. Stay away from Daniel Mwangi. The billionaire's jaw tightened hard. When did this happen? This afternoon. Daniel paced slowly toward the window. They're scared now. Kerubo stood angrily despite the pain in his body. I don't care about your company anymore, he snapped quietly. My daughter is involved now. Daniel turned toward him immediately. I know. No, you don't understand. Kerubo's voice shook with fear and anger. I can survive attacks. I can survive humiliation. But if something happens to Naledi, it won't. You can't promise that silence crashed heavily into the room. Because Kerubo was right. No billionaire truly controlled danger once powerful people became desperate. Daniel looked toward Naledi, sleeping quietly nearby, then back at Kerubo. I need you to testify tomorrow. Kerubo stared at him in disbelief. What? The shareholders' meeting. No. Daniel stepped closer carefully. Kerubo, I said no. Fear had completely replaced pride now. They already attacked me. They already destroyed my taxi. Kerubo lowered his voice shakily. Now they threaten my child. Daniel remained silent, because every word was reasonable. Finally, Kerubo whispered something broken. I'm tired of being brave. The honesty of it hurt. Daniel slowly sat beside him. When I was young, he said quietly, my mother used to tell me something. He looked toward the floor briefly. She said, evil survives because good people become too afraid to stand together. Kerubo laughed bitterly. Your mother never had a dying daughter. No, Daniel admitted softly, but she buried a son once. Kerubo frowned slightly. Daniel rarely spoke about family. I had a younger brother, he continued quietly. He died because we were too poor to afford proper treatment. The room became still. Daniel looked toward Naledi. That's why I cannot walk away from this. For the first time, Kerubo saw something raw beneath the billionaire's calm surface. Not power, Grief. Old grief that never healed completely. Daniel inhaled slowly. If these men continue winning, they will destroy more lives after yours. He met Kerubo's eyes directly now. You returning that wallet exposed people who believed poor men should stay invisible forever. Kerubo looked away painfully. I never wanted war. Neither did I. Outside the hospital window, evening slowly covered Nairobi in orange light. Cars moved endlessly through crowded streets, while ordinary people continued surviving another difficult day, completely unaware of the battle growing inside Mwangi Group. Finally, Kerubo spoke again quietly. If I testify, will this end? Daniel hesitated, then answered honestly. I don't know. That honesty mattered, because false promises would have insulted them both. Kerubo sat silently for a very long time afterward. Then suddenly his phone vibrated again. Another message, this time containing only one sentence. Next time your daughter won't be safe. Kerubo's blood ran cold. Daniel read the message too, and at that exact moment, something dangerous awakened fully inside him. Not fear, rage, cold, controlled rage. Because threatening Kerubo was one thing. Threatening a sick child crossed into unforgivable territory. Daniel slowly stood. His voice became frighteningly calm. Tomorrow, he said quietly, I destroy them. The shareholders' meeting began at exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Inside the massive conference hall at Mwangi Group headquarters, tension moved silently beneath every polished surface. Investors, board members, journalists, and senior executives filled the room, while security guards stood near every entrance. Nobody spoke loudly, because everyone sensed something dangerous was about to happen. At the center of the hall sat Daniel Mwangi, calm, silent, cold. Across from him, Samuel Karanja adjusted his tie repeatedly while pretending confidence, but sweat had already begun forming along his forehead. Several reporters whispered among themselves after noticing unusual security presence inside the building. Then the doors opened again. Kerubo Moraa entered slowly. Instantly, murmurs spread across the room. The taxi driver from the scandal articles, the poor man linked to the billionaire, the man many people had mocked online. Kerubo felt dozens of eyes following him immediately. Expensive suits surrounded him from every direction, while giant television screens displayed company logos above the stage. For a brief moment, old humiliation returned sharply. He did not belong in places like this. But then he remembered Naletti's frightened face, the threats, the destroyed taxi, the fear. And suddenly, shame transformed into something else. Resolve. Daniel stood the moment Kerubo approached. Without embarrassment, without hesitation. That alone shocked half the room. Because powerful men rarely stood publicly beside poor ones. Thank you for coming, Daniel said quietly. Kerubo nodded once. This ends today. Daniel's expression hardened. Yes. The meeting officially began moments later. At first, everything appeared normal. Financial reports, growth projections, corporate announcements. But underneath every presentation, tension kept growing heavier. Finally, Daniel stood. The room immediately became silent. He walked slowly toward the center podium, holding several files in his hands. For years, he began calmly, Mwangi Group has presented itself as a symbol of trust, strength, and progress in Kenya. Several investors nodded automatically. Then Daniel's tone changed. But today I stand before you ashamed. The room stiffened instantly. Samuel Karanja's face lost color slightly. Daniel placed the documents onto the podium. Because corruption has been growing inside this company for years. Whispers erupted immediately across the hall. Journalists grabbed pens. Cameras turned. Executives exchanged nervous looks. Daniel continued steadily. Millions disappeared through fake contracts, offshore accounts, and illegal transfers approved by people trusted with leadership. Samuel suddenly stood. Sir, perhaps this discussion should remain private until investigations finish. Daniel looked directly at him. The investigations are finished. Silence crashed through the room. Then Daniel pressed a button beside the podium. Financial records immediately appeared across the giant screens overhead. Account numbers, transfer histories, company names, amounts stolen. Gasps spread across the hall. Several board members looked stunned. Others looked terrified. Samuel's breathing visibly changed now. These records, Daniel said firmly, connect senior executives inside this company to systematic fraud over multiple years. One investor stood angrily. Who exactly are you accusing? Daniel turned slowly towards Samuel Karanja. The entire room followed his gaze. Samuel forced a tight smile. This is absurd. Daniel said nothing. Instead, another screen displayed photographs. Secret meetings, bank transactions, private properties purchased through hidden shell companies. The room exploded with noise. Journalists began shouting questions immediately. This cannot be real. Is Mwangi Group collapsing? Who else is involved? Samuel slammed one hand against the table. These records are manipulated. Daniel's eyes became ice cold. Then explain the offshore accounts under your control. Samuel's face darkened instantly. Meanwhile, near the back of the hall, Kerubo watched everything unfold in stunned silence. He had known corruption existed, but seeing wealthy men panic publicly over greed felt surreal somehow. One board member suddenly pointed toward Kerubo angrily. This entire scandal started because of that man. Several eyes turned toward the taxi driver again. Samuel seized the opportunity instantly. Yes. His voice sharpened. How convenient that a random taxi driver suddenly appears carrying sensitive company documents. Daniel stepped forward immediately. Careful. But Samuel continued. How do we know he didn't steal information, blackmail someone, manipulate evidence? The room grew uncertain again. Some investors nodded nervously. Others whispered suspiciously. Kerubo felt humiliation returning sharply. Even here. Even now. Poor people remained easiest to blame. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but suddenly Kerubo stepped forward himself. I returned the wallet untouched. His voice was not loud, yet somehow the room quieted immediately. Kerubo stood alone beneath the bright conference lights, wearing simple clothes among powerful people worth millions. Still, his voice remained steady. I could have taken everything inside. He looked around slowly. Money, documents, all of it. Nobody interrupted, because truth carried strange weight when spoken by exhausted people. My daughter was sick. Kerubo continued quietly. I had hospital debts, rent problems. My taxi was dying. His eyes lowered briefly. Nobody would have known if I kept the money. Silence deepened further. Then Kerubo looked directly toward the investors, but I returned it because poverty should never decide whether someone has dignity. Several faces changed immediately. Journalists stopped typing. Even some executives lowered their eyes. Kerubo's voice grew slightly stronger now. You mocked me for being poor. You called me a criminal online. Men attacked me because I chose honesty. His breathing tightened briefly. But the people destroying this company were not taxi drivers. The words hit like stones. Samuel stood angrily. This is emotional nonsense. No, Kerubo answered quietly. This is truth. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then unexpectedly, one elderly board member slowly stood. His hands trembled slightly. I approve some transfers, the old man whispered weakly. The room turned toward him in shock. Samuel stared in disbelief. What are you doing? The old man looked broken suddenly. I knew the contracts were fake. Gasps erupted again. And Samuel told you to sign them, Daniel asked coldly. The old executive nodded slowly. Panic exploded fully across Samuel's face now. This is ridiculous. But another executive stood too. Then another. Fear began collapsing into confession. One by one, hidden truths surfaced publicly beneath the conference hall lights. Years of corruption, bribes, fraud, lies, everything unraveling at once. Samuel suddenly attempted leaving the hall, but security blocked the exit immediately. Daniel looked toward him calmly. It's over. The CFO's face twisted with fury. You think you're different? He spat bitterly. All rich men become corrupt eventually. Daniel's jaw tightened. Maybe, he admitted quietly, but threatening innocent people to protect greed makes you something worse. Police officers entered the hall moments later. The room exploded into chaos once again as journalists shouted questions and cameras flashed endlessly. Meanwhile, through all the noise, Kerubo stood completely still, exhausted, overwhelmed, but finally free from fear. Daniel slowly approached him through the chaos. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Daniel extended his hand publicly in front of the entire room. Not to a businessman, not to an investor, to a poor taxi driver. Kerubo stared at the hand briefly before finally shaking it. And somewhere deep inside the crowded conference hall, people began understanding something uncomfortable. The poorest man in the room had turned out to be the most honorable one there. The days after the shareholders' meeting changed Nairobi completely. News channels replayed the scandal nonstop. Headlines about corruption inside Mwangi Group spread across Kenya and beyond. Samuel Karanja and several executives were arrested within 48 hours after financial investigators uncovered hidden accounts, fraudulent contracts, and illegal transfers worth millions. For weeks, television screens showed the same shocking image repeatedly. A poor taxi driver standing beside billionaire CEO Daniel Mwangi, while powerful executives were led away by police. Public opinion changed almost overnight. The same people who once mocked Kerubo Moraa online now called him a symbol of integrity. Journalists requested interviews daily. Radio stations discussed his story endlessly. But Kerubo refused most invitations. He was too tired for attention. All he wanted was peace. Real peace. Meanwhile, Daniel moved quickly inside Mwangi Group. Entire departments were investigated. Corrupt managers disappeared from offices almost overnight. Financial records were reopened. Worker protections increased. For the first time in years, employees whispered something surprising about the company. Hope. One afternoon, Daniel stood quietly inside a newly renovated office, overlooking Nairobi, while lawyers updated him about ongoing investigations. You could recover most of the stolen funds, one lawyer explained. Daniel nodded absent-mindedly. Money no longer felt important lately, not after everything that happened. His assistant entered moments later. Kerubo Moraa is here. Daniel looked up immediately. Send him in. Kerubo entered slowly, wearing clean but simple clothes. The stitches on his forehead had nearly healed now, though exhaustion still lingered behind his eyes. But something else had changed too. The fear was gone. Daniel stood to greet him. How is Naledi? For the first time in many weeks, Kerubo smiled fully. She's getting stronger. Relief crossed Daniel's face instantly. That's good. Silence settled briefly between them. Then Daniel walked toward the large office window. I've been thinking about something, he said quietly. Kerubo waited. Daniel turned back toward him. You spent your whole life driving people across Nairobi. Kerubo nodded once. Yes, and most of those people never truly saw you. The taxi driver gave a faint smile. That's normal. No. Daniel shook his head slowly. It shouldn't be. He handed Kerubo several papers. Kerubo frowned while reading them. Then his eyes widened completely. A transport company. Small at first, but fully legal and already funded. Several new taxis registered under his name. Insurance? Operating permits? Everything. Kerubo looked up immediately. No. Daniel almost smiled. You haven't even finished reading. I can't accept this. Yes, you can. Kerubo lowered the papers slowly. I didn't help you for rewards. I know. Then why are you doing this? Daniel became quiet for a moment. Finally, he answered honestly. Because one honest man reminded me what leadership is supposed to look like. Kerubo stared at him silently. Daniel continued. Not power, not fear, responsibility. The room became still. Then Daniel added softly, and because your daughter deserves a future where her father no longer suffers alone. For several long seconds, Kerubo said nothing. Emotion tightened painfully inside his chest. His entire life survival had depended on barely holding himself together through exhaustion, humiliation, and fear. Now suddenly, someone was offering him something unfamiliar. Stability. Not pity. Not charity. A real future. Kerubo looked back down at the documents again. You trust me with this? Daniel smiled faintly. You returned millions when your own life was collapsing. He folded his arms calmly. I trust you more than most executives I've ever hired. That finally broke through Kerubo's resistance. Not because of the money, but because somebody finally saw dignity in him instead of poverty. Weeks later, life slowly began changing. Now, Lady was transferred to a better cardiac facility where her treatment continued properly. Her strength returned little by little each day. Color slowly came back to her face. One afternoon, she walked outside the hospital garden without assistance for the first time in months. Kerubo nearly cried watching her. The transport business also began growing steadily. At first, Kerubo struggled adjusting to leadership responsibilities. He still woke before sunrise, instinctively expecting to drive passengers alone through Nairobi traffic. But unlike corrupt businessmen, he understood suffering personally. So he hired drivers others ignored, widowers, older men. young people from poor neighborhoods, single mothers needing work. And slowly, something beautiful began growing from pain. A company built on dignity instead of greed. One evening near sunset, Kerubo visited Wanjiru's grave for the first time in many months. Naledi stood beside him quietly, holding flowers, while soft wind moved through the cemetery grass. "We're okay now, Mama," Naledi whispered gently. Kerubo lowered his eyes. For years, he had carried guilt for failing his family financially after Wanjiru died. But standing there now, beside his recovering daughter, he realized something important. Maybe survival itself had been courage all along. Later that same week, Daniel visited Eastlands again, this time without disguises. Children immediately recognized him from television and surrounded him excitedly, while neighbors watched in disbelief from nearby stalls and balconies. Kamau laughed loudly the moment he saw him. So the billionaire finally visits properly. Even Daniel laughed. Kerubo stepped outside moments later, shaking his head. "You caused chaos in my neighborhood." Daniel looked around at the crowded street. "It reminds me of home." For a moment, both men stood quietly, watching children play football nearby beneath the orange Nairobi sunset. Then Naledi ran outside, smiling brightly. "Papa." "Mr. Daniel?" She looked healthier now, stronger, alive. Daniel crouched slightly. "How's my favorite mathematics teacher?" Naledi grinned proudly. "I got the highest marks." Kerubo laughed softly. "She won't stop talking about it." Naledi suddenly wrapped both arms tightly around her father. Then she looked up at him with shining eyes. "You know something, Papa? What you're the richest man in the world." Kerubo smiled faintly. "I thought rich people had private jets." "No." Naledi shook her head seriously. "Rich means people love you." Silence touched everyone around them softly. Even Daniel looked away briefly afterward, because sometimes children understood truths adults complicated unnecessarily. As evening settled over Nairobi, Kerubo watched the neighborhood around him carefully. The same streets, the same people, the same city. Yet everything felt different now. Not because suffering had disappeared, but because hope finally existed beside it. And somewhere deep inside himself, Kerubo Moraa understood one final truth. Returning that wallet had not changed his life because it brought money. It changed his life because in a cruel world that expected selfishness, he chose to remain human. The lesson behind Kerubo Moraa's story. Sometimes life tests people in the cruelest ways possible. It tests the poor differently from the rich. When someone is hungry, desperate, grieving, or trying to save a loved one, doing the right thing can feel almost impossible. That is why Kerubo Moraa's story matters so deeply. He was not honest because life was easy. He was honest when honesty cost him everything. And in today's world, that kind of integrity is rare. This story reminds us that dignity does not come from money, status, or power. Some of the wealthiest people carry empty hearts, while some of the poorest carry enough humanity to change lives around them. Kerubo's kindness healed not only his daughter's future, but also the broken spirit of a billionaire who had forgotten what true leadership meant. Justice may arrive slowly, sometimes painfully slowly. But darkness cannot survive forever when ordinary people continue choosing courage over corruption. If this story touched your heart, tell us where you are watching from and what lesson stayed with you the most. Would you have returned the wallet if you were in Kerubo's position? And if you believe stories about hope, healing, justice, and humanity still matter in this world, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who needs encouragement today. Your support helps us continue bringing powerful emotional stories to people across the world.